Hello everyone, welcome to the Founder Insight Podcast. I'm your host, Drew Zias, and today I'm joined by Mike Suprovici.
Hello everyone, good to be back on this podcast. For those of you that don't know, I lead the Alumni Success Group here at the Founder Institute, and our role is to basically help our companies scale. So we oversee a portfolio of over 4,000 companies, and there are very few things that I haven't seen in regards to startup creation and the entire process. So I'm happy to share that knowledge with you.
And today we're definitely going to be talking about the creation side, as we're talking about one of the earliest things that you can do for your startup to help it succeed, which is the RAT, the Riskiest Assumptions Test. Mike, we aren't talking about the animal here. We're talking about the startup concept. So what is a RAT?
Yeah, so I think a lot of people are probably familiar with the term MVP, minimally viable product. And a RAT is another iteration of that concept. It stands for the Riskiest Assumption Test. So the idea is that to find kind of like what the actual riskiest assumption is in your business and do anything that you can to actually test that out. And sometimes it requires building something, but most of the time it doesn't, right? So that's kind of the idea there, as opposed to going out and building an entire product. Sometimes you have to, but most of the time you don't.
Okay, so what makes it superior to MVPs? People have been making those for a long time, right?
Yeah, I don't know if that's superior. It's just that it's basically much more focused and much easier to kind of like be much more actionable, right? Like when you think about what is the like basically if you have a list of things that that if this thing doesn't work, your startup will not succeed, and everything's pending on that, that's actually going to help you get to validation much faster. Let's take an example. So let's say you're building like a marketplace, and you're a marketplace that connects pet owners with pet supplies. What is like the riskiest assumption of that market, right? I guess if we were to kind of like sit there and think about it from first principles and like really dig deep into this thing, is probably, can you actually create a transaction? Can you actually have your pet owner purchase a pet supply or something like that on this market, right? And that's something that if you think about it, is like not something that you need to actually do a product for. What you would do is you would manually facilitate that transaction to see if it even works and if it's something that people even want, right? And so that's kind of one way to kind of think about it.
Okay, whereas if you're building an MVP, you'd have to build bare bones whole platform to
you might build a website for that, and all that. And I don't think I just think that it's better to test as much stuff as you can before you build, because the more you know, the better you're going to build. Otherwise, what's going to happen is you're going to throw away a lot of stuff that you build initially.
Gotcha. So this seems like it's all about testing assumptions, obviously based on the name. And assumptions, by definition, are kind of difficult for us to detect. As everyone's an assumption holder. Few people admit it, because they're pieces of these kind of perceived knowledge where we think they're the truth, right? So how can we defeat that bias? How do we identify our riskiest assumption?
Yeah, that's the toughest part. I mean, as a founder, right? Like just being like brutally honest and realistic with yourself, because you want to try to a practical way to do this is to write stuff down. Like, okay, this is the risk. This is the risk number 1, risk number 2, risk number 3, and just kind of create a list. That's what I actually recommend founders do. Is they start to think about like kind of what are the riskiest pieces, riskiest things in their business, and once you have this list, you can stack rank them, right? Sometimes you can do this with advisors, by the way. This is also a good idea, like if you have really trusted advisors. But at the very minimum, by yourself, you can like sit there and stack rank them. You can have like the top 3, right? And now stack rank again the top 3, and then start with the first one, and then try to see if you can do a riskiest assumption test on the first one, and do another test on the second one.
Yeah, somebody came to me recently with a question about this that I honestly didn't know how to answer, because it seemed almost like a team question. They asked me, how do you convince other people in your company that they are relying on unverified assumptions? From the get-go, everyone's often really excited to like build something, right?
Yeah, those are actually that's kind of a different thing in a way. Like, as a leader, you need to inspire people to join the mission, and if you agree that this is a mission that's worth pursuing and, taking the risk to go and do, then as you try to define and help solve that mission or whatever, you will do various tests, right? Like this is the thing with startups. Like a startup is basically a big experiment, right? And even like the funding stages are like your funding projects, essentially. It's kind of how it is. And so in this situation, you're going to be running multiple experiments, and most won't work and some will work, and then eventually one will work really, really well. And if you do this together with your customers, you're going to find a lot of things out. Like, does the customer actually need this? Do they really need this so badly that they're willing to pay for it? Will they willing to need it so bad that they're willing to pre-order it, right? And things like that, right? And so, I mean, and that's part of the process. I actually think this is really helpful for teams because you're kind of in this together, right? The more ownership and you have of the project your team members have, even if it's a loss, the better, because then there's an opportunity to improve it.
All right. So rats generally start with a hypothesis, right? There's something that you're testing, and hypotheses usually contain two elements. So it's like A, I believe something about my customer, right? And then B, I will know that I'm right if X happens, right?
Yeah.
So what's an example of doing that poorly? What's a bad hypothesis?
Well, I mean, a bad hypothesis is one where a person doesn't really think critically about the entire hypothesis that they've come up with. So, if you just come up with a hypothesis that I would like to have XYZ product and haven't really thought through who else might need it and why and what the big benefit is of that is without thinking critically about like why and how and all that, then that's generally a bad way to kind of think about the hypothesis, right? So to think about it more practically, as you're doing research and you're thinking about like this hypothesis, it's okay for you to start with this, I need XYZ product. But then what you want to do is you want to try to kind of study like what the competitive landscape looks like, how do people solve this problem now, in order for you to figure out other ways that this product can work and what the actual needs are. Are they met by all these other products that are out there and things like that? And then you can say, okay, look, this is clear. There's clearly a need for this. It's unmet because of XYZ, XYZ this and that. A good way is like when you see like a product that really sucks and that has really bad ratings, right? Like in the App Store or something, but yet it has lots of usage and lots of downloads that people are willing to put up with it because even though it's bad, right? So that's like a really interesting kind of thing to think about.
Yeah, that's like a market opportunity signaling there.
Yeah. Not that you should go out and do that. It's more of a mission. It comes back to your mission. We've talked about this in previous podcasts, but like the reality is that you really want to be in a situation where, almost like a scientist like looked into this and really researched this well so that you understand kind of how to even create a hypothesis, really, right? And part of that is talking to your customers. Part of that is, researching for hours and hours on why something could potentially work. That's what I would say as a first step. And that doesn't necessarily happen always with the problem. It also can be like with an opportunity, right? Like I would argue most social products are not like solving a problem, but there may be an opportunity for people to connect in a different way or better. So let's say you're building an app that wants to connect people based on positive things versus like, I don't want to say like negative things, but like right now a lot of the social media stuff is based on like, does somebody like my thing? But if you can make it more extrinsic, like by like providing people with help or something like that, then you say, okay, that's interesting. That's an opportunity, right? Then a good way to kind of think about that is just to start either surveying people potentially, or like running some Facebook ads to see if people may even want to download this app. That's an interesting way to kind of think about it. Is this something you even want? Do people want?
Right. It seems like that kind of segues into another question you should like ask yourself, which is this the smallest possible thing that I could be doing to test this assumption? Right, to avoid overdoing it. How do you reel yourself in from like just straight up building things?
Well, that's one of the good things about startups a lot of times is that we are constrained by money, and that allows us to, well, we don't even have a choice sometimes. That being said, as a founder, it's really important to kind of think about like who wants it, and as a result of that, you thinking about like distribution, because you might not be able to build a business if distribution is difficult, and it's too expensive, because then the cost of distribution might be less than the cost or might be higher than the cost that you can, charge for something, right? So like what you want to do is this is why it's like, I kind of use that example, like maybe running a Facebook ad or something,
Right.
Or however you want to do it, because you want to kind of see kind of like, man, what's involved in getting this out to people, and what would I have to charge for something like this to even work?
Like what would your cost of customer acquisition be and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And like, do you recommend setting a traction goal from the get-go of identifying I need X amount of users to be profitable or something like that?
Yeah, I think it's hard to put that in general. As a general rule, though, like I personally am a big believer in like activation and retention before like traction, because it's really difficult to grow unless you retain your customers, right? Otherwise, you're kind of like a leaky bucket.
Mm-hmm.
But what I would say there as a first step is just to kind of think about more like, how can I distribute this product? Like, how can I get this out to people? What is the most common method, right? And then when you think about that at scale, it's like, well, it's going to be like, there's not a whole lot of word of mouth here. Okay, then that means I really have to work hard to get it. Like, now if there is word of mouth, then that's a whole different thing. And then you have to kind of think about how that word of mouth could go. But all these things are like really helpful in helping you determine kind of like what could potentially be like the cost of acquiring somebody. And then when you have that, then it helps you really think about how you can make money, right? So a lot of times people are like, well, I'll just make money using advertising. Okay, well then take a look at like what, like the kind of volume that you would need in order for you to make that even like sustainable. You would need a tremendous amount of scale for advertising to work, like as far as like eyeballs and things like that. So that means that you would have to figure out a way to get propped up by millions and millions and millions and millions of venture capital for you to have even a realistic shot at this, right? So, and then to do that, you'd have to have like incredible like distribution and growth to be able to do that. And it's just like a difficult thing, right? It doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. It's just something you should think about, right? So back to the riskiest assumption test for a social product like this is like, do people even care about this, right? Like, do people even care? And you can check, you can figure out if people care via a variety of different means, right? Like, as I've talked about, like a Facebook ad. I talked about you actually going and talking to people about this. One hack that I always tell founders is just to not mention that it's your product when you go out and talk to people, because like when you mention that it's your product, then people won't give you as good of advice, because they're going to be pulling punches because they don't want to like hurt your feelings, you know. So you could
some dumb friend of mine came up with this.
Exactly. You can say, you don't have to lie about it, but you could just like not mention it, right? Because then what happens is then they might give you candid feedback, right?
Yeah, and that's very hard to get. Super valuable. So you pretty much have to almost fill out a business model canvas beforehand or something like that, or at least think through that process.
Yeah, everybody does it differently, so I'm not going to just say just fill out the business model canvas, although that's a really good tool for a lot of people. But I do think that it is important for you at the very minimum to kind of just write down what you think are like the riskiest assumptions of this potential idea. And then once you do that, see if you can figure out a test to see it, because otherwise it might not be worth you testing out the second or the third one or whatever, because if the first one is kind of holding everything together and you can't really build a business there, then you're screwed anyway.
Well, yeah, that would be a problem.
Yeah.
So you listed out a bunch of different types of rats that people could run, from just talking to customers in an interview style, maybe like making a landing page, Facebook ad, something like that, pretty basic. And I kind of want to dive into interviews. How do you avoid asking leading questions and kind of getting useless answers?
Yeah, the one of the best ways to avoid asking leading questions is to ask open-ended questions.
Okay.
So an example there is, would you use something like this? Right? That's a yes or no closed-ended question.
Right.
How do you use this product? That's a broad question. It's like, so anything that kind of starts with like something like a how or why are you using something or something like this, that really just lets the person like talk, right? And that's kind of what you want, is like a conversation, and then you can just like learn a lot from those conversations as you're interviewing potential clients and customers.
Okay, so who should you share your rat with? Should you focus on just one customer slice, or should you try to try a few different ones?
Well, it really depends on the riskiest assumption, right? And so if the riskiest assumption, if you're building a really complicated B2B product, or let's say a healthcare product where the buyer is the actual like insurance company, right? Like what you want to think about like is, is there ensure like there for the insurance company to even consider using this, right? And so you can even make like a sales call to their insurance company to ensure, would they, want to do this for a specific company, like the company that they're insuring, right? So there's like multiple layers of this, right? Sometimes it's an interview, sometimes it's basically like trying to facilitate that transaction as manually as possible using like a Google form or something like that. Sometimes it's just like going through like the actual like B2B sales process without even building something, right? Because then what you find out in the B2B sales process is that there's multiple like influencers in the process, and then there's who you maybe thought were the buyers, but the actual buyer turns out to be like the COO, which has a completely different need and all that, and maybe your product doesn't solve that, or the way you were thinking about it does.
Huh. So you mentioned B2B. I kind of have a question on this. So let's say you're building a riskiest assumption test for a B2B product. Mm-hmm. And your riskiest assumption is that a handful of specific companies, very specific companies, only a few of them, but who are obviously willing to pay a lot, like enterprise tech, would be interested in your efficiency tech or something like that. How would you approach them to gauge their interest when you don't have any product yet, and you kind of want to avoid sinking those relationships before they start or appearing unprofessional?
Well, you can't really worry about that, honestly, as a startup, mostly because, you might not even be alive like later. Like, it's like you're kind of like trying to solve like a Friday problem on like a Monday with this one. You can't worry about stuff like that. Like, you need to basically go out and like literally execute. And if somebody says no, then it's okay. Like, it's part of the process, but you do have to try. And so what I would say there is that, first of all, in most good sales processes are not really going out like trying to like close people. What they're doing is, most good salespeople go out and try to like interview people and trying to learn stuff. So I would approach it more like trying to learn stuff before you even format any sort of solution anyway. So that's the first step, to try to figure out if this is like a true problem that somebody would want to pay. To look professional, you create like a professional sales email, which you can learn about just by going online and figuring out what that is. And you go in and you ask and you figure out kind of what the process is and all that. And best case scenario could be like, oh, we really need this now. Okay, that's a pretty good opportunity. But the most likely scenario is that you're going to learn that that's not the right person that you should even be talking to, and you need to talk to somebody else, and it might be really difficult for you to get in front of them. And then you might be like, well, okay, it might take me like a year to get this in. How do I know that this is good or bad? I don't know. Like, I don't know if it's even worth putting a year into this, because I don't know if I can charge enough, right? So there's ways to do that. The other thing I would say is, you can go to places where a lot of these people hang out and just talk to them casually, right? So there's certainly lots of conferences. Going to like the after party, if you're like a broke founder, the goal, you shouldn't be spending thousands of dollars to go to these conferences. But what you could do is you could go and figure out where the after party is and hang out there. And then it's
a nice hack.
That's actually like that's actually where the magic happens anyway. Honestly, like when it comes to like networking and things like that, and you can really learn. And you can ask some of these questions to kind of learn if this is like something that people want to buy. Yeah, it's true that the rat thing is much more difficult than B2B for sure. But a lot of it is also, a lot of B2B stuff is around sales and how can you actually sell efficiently into a product, into a company. Mm-hmm. And that's what you really need to figure out, really, in order, before the product, like if the product works.
Yeah. So off the top of your head, do you have any examples of really great rats?
Well, I think that there's certainly like a few. One of our companies, like Stock Card, they started out with like an email, and they started getting subscribers. Like, do people even care, right? And they started out with an email list, and then that email list started to grow, and you can tell that people wanted the thing. And what Stock Card does is they basically recommend kind of stocks that might be good investments, essentially.
Oh, so they're just kind of recommending it via email at first, just to kind of test the
Yeah,
waters.
yeah, exactly. So that was like an interesting thing, and then eventually they built a really nice product that kind of manages this and helps you actually really like do really deep like research with it. So that's an interesting one that I've seen like recently. There's several other companies like doing similar stuff in like B2B where they're just like literally going in like interviewing customers to figure out exactly what their market is and who their market is. We have a company right now that's about to finish the Silicon Valley cohort, and they started with a completely different customer archetype, and then they realized it's like this other customer archetype because they kind of went through this process.
So once you run your riskiest assumption tests and you've kind of validated your assumption if you're right, or it
Yeah.
seems like you're right, what does that mean? Should you start pre-ordering the champagne for your IPO or?
Yeah, totally. You should do that. No, it means that it's a pretty good. That means that you probably should go to the second one. Like if you have a list, you might have two or three big ones that are key that you may need to verify. And again, I said sometimes you do need to do more stuff to validate that. It's not every time. You might not be able to get away with just doing an email thing. Sometimes you might actually have to build something, right? And so again, depends on the business. There's some things that you need to build on, but there's a lot of things that you don't. Marketplaces being a really good example where you probably can just start facilitating transactions without building anything. And so that's a whole nother topic. But you go down the list, right? And then if you can get the few ones that are kind of risky, like, oh, okay, this is interesting, then you might have something that's really powerful there.
Okay, and if you run a rat and you get kind of the opposite results and things aren't panning out too well, how many different rats should you run to try to validate this? Should you like pivot to a different idea entirely, try with different customer bases?
Well, look, you can pivot on your product, right? But it's really hard to pivot on your mission. And so make sure that you always have your mission as kind of like your North Star, and that can keep you grounded into what you're going to do. So I think it's perfectly fine to kind of like do multiple rats within the same kind of space and the same type of like mission for the business. I think it's much more difficult to do that if you're changing like the entire, like you're going from like building a game to building a medical device company, right? It's just very difficult to do that, and everything changes, right? I think that if the rat fails is not necessarily a bad thing. I think that it just maybe unlocks another opportunity for you to try a rat in a different place.
And I got one more question for you, Mike. It's when should you run a riskiest assumptions test? When's the best time to do it? Not like of year, but of you thinking through your idea. Should you wait until you have like team members with you? Should I run one today on an idea I came up with this afternoon?
Yeah, again, I wouldn't run a riskiest assumption test until you actually have a list of assumptions, first and foremost, that's been prioritized pretty well by you and possibly even some other people. Then when you have that, then I would try to go out and run it. Now, as I've said before, there are certain things that are just like, they're like just difficult to test, right? Like none of the advice we give here is like one size fits all. We have a company, it's called Antibiotics. They basically make, swallowable like robots that can be driven through the intestines, kind of like a video game using a remote control. It's pretty difficult to do like a riskiest assumption test there without dying, right? Like, you know what I mean? Like you can like, I'm using that mostly as an example. But there are certain things that are in there. It's like, first of all, can you even create propulsion for this to work, right? So what they did is that they basically have like a burrito-sized camera, right, that they could put in a pool, and they created the propulsion, and then it looks like the propulsion could actually work potentially in a human if the right conditions were met, right? And so that was like, okay, well, you can't have a camera that can be like driven through the body without propulsion, so they tested out propulsion, and then they're like, okay, great, now can we make this like half the size, and can we make it half the size, and now it's like the size of your finger, and pretty soon it'll be able to swallow it, right? And so that's kind of how you want to think about this. But ideally, yeah, I mean, you want to think about this as early as possible, and also you want to think about it within like the budget that you have as well, because certain riskiest assumption tests, certain rats are more expensive than others. But overall, like the earlier the better, right? Like this is something we in the Core Founder Institute program, this is something that, regardless of the stage the company is coming into the program in, we generally recommend that they do like within the first few weeks.
Wow. Okay. Well, thank you so much for joining, Mike. This was super enlightening. Can't wait to talk about other things in the future, man.
All right, man. Looking forward to it as well. Thanks, Drew.
Yeah, for sure. And I only got like one rat joke in there, and I have another one. I don't want to say it though. It's just a little cheesy.
All right, man. Thanks.